Ladies, gentlemen, and none of the above, welcome to episode 13 of the Puzzle Advent Calendar. Now, this is my second episode in the series, and seeing as how my last project was a Megamix build, I wanted to up the ante by going for a Gigamix project this time around. Now, the project that I have planned for today, I originally did with a Megamix, not as part of the Puzzle Advent Calendar, it was just a build video on its own. Unfortunately, I kind of screwed that puzzle up by sanding a little too asymmetrically, and I ended up just kind of making a couple of the pieces smaller than they needed to be. So, lesson learnt, and what I'm going to do today is the same modification, or at least as best a similar modification as I can do on a Gigamix. Now, I didn't have a Gigamix. I did have a Gigamix in parts. I had a Gigamoid that I hadn't worked on in over a year, and I had enough pieces to kind of put together the top and bottom layers again. I don't really know the exact details of this modification yet. Really, I just want to start with the cuts and then see what I have to work with and go from there. So, let's get started. Now, the seasonal aspect of this project was of course the hexagonal cross-section, which in my mind resembled a snowflake to some degree, and I had a really cool idea of putting some extensions in the centerpieces and some of the edge pieces as well to give it more of a snowflake look, but I quickly realized that that would make this design a lot more complicated than it already was, and I'm gonna come right out and say it, this puzzle ended up being a failure. Now, I won't lie, I had my suspicions before I even started that this puzzle was not going to work out, but I hadn't modified a Gigamix in a while, and I really just wanted to work with this one because it was made up of a load of spare parts and pieces, and to be honest, I just wanted to get rid of it. So I started with the tried and tested method that I usually start with, which is tightening up the puzzle so that it doesn't turn, and then taking it over to my bandsaw to make the first cuts. I tilted the table the number of degrees that worked best for me, and then I very carefully shaved off as much of the layers as I could, making sure not to cut the heads of the screws off. These would end up needing to be modified later anyway. You can see how most of the top layer had been shaved off, but I still had some way to go, but I wasn't going to cut any further because that would end up being sanded away. So I took the puzzle over to my desk and I disassembled it so I could start cleaning up all of the pieces and getting them ready for filling. Because my bandsaw blade was getting a little dull, I ended up melting a lot of the pieces together, and so I had to break them apart at first, and then go through the ordeal of cleaning out all of the pieces before I could start filling them. But after everything was cleaned out, I got the epoxy sculpt out and I mixed up enough to fill all of the pieces. And after everything had hardened, I carved out all of the epoxy sculpts so that I could reassemble the puzzle, and this is what it looked like. Now at this point in the build, everything was going just fine, but it was now that things started to take a turn for the worst. Normally with these failures I wouldn't post them at all, but I am presented with a fantastic opportunity to at least explain why this puzzle doesn't work, and it all starts with the tensions of the puzzle. Now whenever I'm sanding everything down, I make sure to have it as tight as possible so that the pieces don't move. But I couldn't sand these faces down without modifying the heads of the screws because then I'd sand them off, and so I reduced the screw head diameter and sunk them down a little further into the centerpieces. Unfortunately, this means that those centers don't hold on as well, and things were a little springy. And that's bad, because that means that the pieces move, and I don't want them to move. So as I was sanding everything down, I started to remove really quite important support structures, and things started to warp and shift, and that was where everything started going wrong. I tried to glue some pieces together just to hold them temporarily, and I ended up using a lot more super glue than I needed, which just made more of a hassle a little later on, but that was a problem that I could fix. What I couldn't fix was the mismatch between the pieces, and because I was sanding down a surface that didn't have a whole lot of reference surfaces, I ended up having to shuffle the pieces around a lot, and I just started making a whole lot more mistakes than I should have. Now, even though this puzzle wasn't working out the way I expected it to, I could already see a potential fix to this design, and I'm definitely going to revisit the Shengshou Gigamix and try some more modifications like this. I don't like being defeated by problems like this, I like to solve them, and it's one of the reasons why I jumped into this project without knowing whether or not I could complete it. But with all of the pieces sanded as well as they could, I took the puzzle over to my desk and disassembled it because now it was time for the finishing process, which was to round over all of the pieces and reassemble everything. And that is where the build video part of this video ends. Unfortunately, as I was doing the final kind of steps in this process, I realized that this puzzle wasn't gonna work. It does actually work, and I've sticked it up kind of nice here with what you can see is a bit of a chromatic color scheme around at the outside, although unfortunately half of it is unsticked, and this is unsticked intentionally. As I was putting the puzzle back together, I realized that there was a lot of mismatching between the pieces, and the reason for this is the same reason that the Megamix variant of this puzzle failed, which is that the shaping method that I'm using just doesn't work. When you tighten everything up and then you start to remove a load of pieces, you end up with a lot of flexing and warping, and unfortunately it makes the stuff that you're sanding kind of mismatch, and I ended up having to use super glue to hold all of these pieces together while I was sanding it, but that just made new problems, which is pieces were loose and they started sliding around, and as a result, if you get up real close, you can see a lot of pieces that are just at different levels. And if I had a few more days, maybe I could fix this, but that would involve sanding down a lot further than I need to or want to. At least it does work, and you can see the functionality. It also shapeshifts, and I actually think that a few more iterations of this puzzle are in order, and I should be able to get it to work sometime in the future. Although unfortunately, this video is a failure. I have a failure that is forever immortalized in the 2020 Puzzle Advent Calendar. But these things happen, and I do this kind of stuff for a reason. I learn about how these puzzles work, I learn about how these mechanisms work and how I can employ different techniques to make these kinds of puzzles function, and I also get to show you guys my failures just as much as my successes, and I think that's an important thing to show people is what goes wrong just as much as what goes right. But anyways, with this Christmas not miracle out of the way, if you want to continue on with the Puzzle Advent Calendar and follow along with all the videos that have been coming out, I'm going to leave a link in the description to the Puzzle Advent Calendar playlist, which has compiled all of the videos that have come out so far, and will continue to add to them every day when the next video comes out. And also make sure to subscribe to Puzzle Building 101, which is one of my favorite modding channels as well, for the next video that's going to be coming out tomorrow. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Check this out. I recently had my wisdom teeth out,